wonderful wife. She had 8 children. And you can't never say 8. She has 8 children. She has 24 grandchildren.
So did I.
25. It's easy to lose count.
24.
I was
If you have a
told.
really, really Catholic family. And then I think it's 34 great-grandchildren.
Right.
Isn't that great? Wow. And she has some priceless stories to tell about growing up Catholic in Philadelphia and growing up with her wonderful brother, his early years as a priest, even before he became a priest. One of the priceless stories she
I could
told
never
me
tell all the
down at
stories.
Cardinal conference in Georgetown. That goes on concurrently with the March for Life. It's at Georgetown University. And he had a close connection with Georgetown, so they named this wonderful conference after him. And it's usually, let's say the March for Life is on Friday, then the Cardinal conference is always on Saturday, right there at Georgetown. And I had the opportunity to meet her a few years ago. And she was telling me about her wonderful brother, and was saying, as a young boy, he would go around the house, and here he'd make sure chasuble on. Remember, that's what we call priestly vestments, chasuble. And we'd be pretending to sing Mass and have a beautiful memory. And she has lots and lots of beautiful memories. Please welcome, all the way from Ridley Park, Pennsylvania, Mary O'Connor Ward Donegan. Hey. Thank you, dear.
All right. I'm here and I am ashamed of myself because some years ago, Jack gave me one of the pro-life shirts. And when he said they're still in the drawers, mine is still in a drawer. I should have worn it today. But you want to hear about Cardinal O'Connor. I was not one. The Cardinal was very happy about my introduction to this world. He really, truly wanted a cowboy suit. Now, I'm the youngest in the O'Connor family. He was 7 years old when I was born. My father met him at the corner of the street and had a big smile on his face and said to the dear Cardinal, "I have a surprise for you." And he thought, oh, maybe I got my cowboy suit. Because my father had convinced him that a pony just wouldn't fit into our row house in the city. So we got home, he got home with my dad, and my mother said, "I have a surprise for you." And of course, I was the surprise. He was totally devastated. He saw a nurse there and thought, it's got to be hers, and said to the nurse, is this your baby? And she said, no, it's your mother's. And he just thought to himself, well, I have a nickel, maybe I can save 15 cents and I can run away from home. But as it turned out, he kind of got used to me, and we became very good friends. He was so good to me as a child. I was entertained by him. I was taught things by him. I learned how to swim, how to skate, how to ride a horse as time went on, as we got a little bit older. So it was wonderful growing up with him. Even when he was in the seminary, he would come home during the summer and we would go off on some adventure that he would think up to have us have a good time. So if you have any particular thing that you would be interested in knowing, you can ask me and maybe I can fill you in on it. But anyway, he went into the seminary. I was about 3rd grade. And I thought, well, there he goes, you know. I'm not going to see him for a while. But he kept in touch with me all the time. And this continued all through my years. When I was in high school, he even wrote letters to me in Latin because I was in the Latin class. and I had no clue half the time what they said. So I took them in and said, "Sister, what's this say?" But that was how good he was to me. So time went on, and I just missed him every single day of my life. He was just so good and kind. And he worked in the parish. He would go up to Mass. He would go to Mass frequently. But he will tell you in the book, in one of the books that I have, that he was impressed by the pastor that we had when he was growing up, Father Murphy, and then he was impressed by the Christian Brothers when he was in high school. He spent only a little over a year in a Catholic high school. He went all through public school. But he was, and I laughed because I read in the book that it was when he went to West Catholic that he decided to be a priest. That's not really true. He decided he wanted to be a priest when he was very young. And he was more impressed by the Christian Brothers in high school, and it probably helped foster his vocation. But that he would take me in his room and say, when I was learning how to, when I went to school and was learning about how the robes that the priests wore and what was done at Mass, and he'd say, "Come into my room, I'll show you how to say Mass." Although I never did that. I never said Mass. He was a brilliant man. He had a degree in clinical psychology from Catholic U, and then went on to get a doctorate at Georgetown in political science. And I think most of you know that he had a good head for politics. At least he had to have it when he later on in his life. But I remember vividly his ordination, going there, going home, having the party at home, because nobody at that time had an excess of money. So you didn't have big parties at some hotel or anything like that. Anything you had would be in your home. And I had a difficult time because to me and our family, his name was always Jack. Until the day he was ordained, and to my mother, he became John. So John was our John. In fact, it was very definite that he was our John. Everyone else still called him Jack. And it was his name. And then I also read in here that several people in New York called him Jack. Not true. That was not something that went on. But his first assignment as a priest was to live at a parish in Delaware County. Now, I was raised in Philadelphia, and I thought the world dropped off at my little town, Darby. And when he went to this other place, I thought, oh my word, where is that? You know, which isn't far beyond Darby. But I found out there was a Delaware County. I couldn't see anything except Philadelphia. But he lived at St. Gabriel's Parish in Norwood and taught at St. James High School in Chester. And there are some amazing things that happened with that. He had a pastor that didn't care for any priest that was out after 9 o'clock at night. So unfortunately, if you teach high school, or if you're involved in the parish at all, which he made sure he always was, he would get home later, because sometimes in high school there'd be football games, baseball games, so that he'd have to attend those, or at least he felt as though he should attend them. And many times did he have to climb up the outside of the building to get up to the third floor, where his bedroom was because the doors to the rectory would be locked. So he was brave as far as in addition to being young enough to do that. But he was there and loved teaching there and taught there until 1952. The stories also say that when Cardinal O'Hara, or I think it was started out with Cardinal Spellman, decided that they needed more chaplains. And Cardinal O'Hara thought that John O'Connor would fit perfectly into that field, so he asked him if he would go. I have other ideas about why he wanted to, or why he was anxious to go into the Navy, which he went into, was in the service for 27 years, was all over the world, was in Vietnam, and he was named Bishop of the Military Ordinate. He left the service as a Rear Admiral. Starting out as an ensign, that was quite an accomplishment. He was in Vietnam, and there's some pictures in here. Well, there's one picture in here that shows him saying Mass on the hood of a Jeep. And I talked to a correspondent at one time that was with him, and he said we're in the same tent and just lay there and listened to the missiles going over. So we were a very happy family that he fortunately came home with a few minor scrapes and bruises, surviving a helicopter crash, but at least he was in one piece. It was really difficult. At the time that he was very close to all of my children. I lost my husband when the Cardinal retired from the service right after he was named a bishop. And he was named the bishop of the military ordinariate. And he resigned from the Navy and lived in New York and was very tied up in the UN because it was practically across the street from where he was assigned. He was there, and then he ended up being named the Bishop of Scranton. The Bishop of Scranton was, we were thrilled with that. Of course, we liked Scranton very much. And I had told, I was telling Jack that in Scranton, I told him I always liked Scranton the best. Because he'd say, well, why is that? And I said, because I had a place to park. There was always a place to park. In New York, no. My husband died shortly after my husband was named to Scranton. The first year after that, my family, my children, and I, all went to Scranton to have Christmas with the Cardinal because we missed him so much. He became the foster father for my children, and as they were growing up, they made no kind of decisions without saying, have to call Uncle Jack. Everything had to go through him. He made decisions, or helped them make decisions about going to college, what they should study, on and on and on. So it was an interesting time. Then as a result, we got closer because now I at least had a mentor for my children since their father was gone. And we had as I said, spending the time with him in Scranton. And as it turned out, at the time, my youngest daughter went to the University of Scranton, so this gave us an extra tie to that. I'm thinking of what else I can tell you. Yes. Jack asked me what I remember about the installation at Scranton. And I said, oh, I remember it very well. In fact, that was my husband. My husband, Hugh Ward, was a very close friend of my brother. And actually, my brother introduced me to my husband. So it was, as a result, it was a very close-knit arrangement between he and my children and myself. So when my husband died, it was a very big blow to him as well. In fact, I can still remember that funeral, and my brother gave the homily with tears running down his face. But what else can I tell you about that era?
Mary, why don't you tell them about your second husband and how many kids?
Mark listened. Mark made a mistake of asking me questions on the way the drive here. I had the 8 children. I was a widow for over 30 years and married a man that I had known for 25 years. He also had 8 children. So we ended up with a big family. But then, now, unfortunately, he died in November. So again, I told Mark that a couple in our parish celebrated their 60th anniversary, and I said, great, I had 2 husbands and never made it to 40 years. So it's some...
Explain exactly how your brother introduced you to your first husband.
Oh, well, at the time, I've had various professions throughout the years. And at the time, I was a stewardess for American Airlines. They called them stewardesses then, not flight attendants. And we were much, it's not quite as relaxed as they are now. We had to wear our full uniforms all the time, including a hat and high heels, and et cetera, et cetera. But we were on very old planes, of course. But my brother kept telling Hugh, I have to introduce you to my sister. And she was, yeah. And he had just gotten out of the service from World War II. And one day, my brother decided, we're out in the car, and he said, oh, I have to stop here for a minute. And we stopped at a house in Ridley Park where, surprisingly, my husband lived. And that was how I met my first husband. So, and they were very close. And he would, God bless you, he would drive. My husband would drive to the moon if my brother asked him to do it. It was that much that he cared about. He got to know each other with my husband's brother went to St. James High School, and apparently was having, some difficulties, and got involved with Hugh's mother. And he went to the house to talk to her about the boy, and that was how we met Hugh, who had just gotten home from that. And I won't even tell you that apparently when I got there, my husband had worked all night, so I met him in a bathrobe, because my to-be mother-in-law went up and woke him up to come down because my brother was there. So he came down, and he was not thrilled, I'm sure, about
Mary, can you
meeting.
tell us about your experiences in speaking pro-life messages around the world? I know you mentioned other countries.
Of him?
Well, were you doing it yourself? Or
Pardon?
were you speaking?
No, My job was speaking at churches for tithing. For tithing, which I did all over,
That's interesting to know too.
yeah,
Yeah, so we could all benefit from
with all the churches that need money these days, and I have been every place with that.
Any pro-life stories from your brother's life? I'm sure there are plenty, but ones you'd like to mention.
He first he went to Dachau. In fact, he had 2 of my boys with him at the time. And went into where the furnaces, put his hand inside one of the furnaces, and he said you could feel the ashes. And it horrified him so much that he said never again would he have a homily without talking about pro-life. And he didn't. When it came time to get to New York, my husband had called him after Cardinal Cook died. My husband called him and said, "You're going to New York." And he said, "No, that's silly. I've only been in Scranton for 7 months. They're not going to, the Pope would never do that." The Pope did do it. And he went to New York. And my husband, who was so sure that he was going to New York, never got that word. He died before the word came through that he was going to New York. But I had so much admiration for him because he wasn't afraid to speak out. He wasn't afraid to buck the bigwigs. He became, I think, as you all know, he was a very good friend of Mayor Koch. And the mayor, of course, was not pro-life, but for some reason, they were able to exist. And in fact, funny stories with the mayor would go to midnight mass every year. And I remember one time when I was there, when my brother said, "If any of you have trouble figuring out what we're doing at the midnight mass, when to stand or when to sit or anything," he said, "just watch the mayor." And of course, that got a big laugh at the cathedral too. His time at Scranton was incredible. He had a priest that worked with the prisoners. The people there were devastated when he was called to New York. New York, of course, the greeting was kind of lukewarm. And because he had spent the 27 years in the Navy, of course, the headlines came out, now we have a hawk, like he was going to support the war and, send everybody into battle. The only battle he was interested in sending them into was the pro-life battle. But he never backed down on anything if he knew that he was right. He never missed seeing the St. Patrick's Day parade. Was out there. He had everything, even in the rain. He'd have an umbrella, but he watched every bit of that parade. He was not afraid to get in and say, it's wrong to kill babies. And told them that any woman that had a problem could come to him, and he would make sure that she got the care, make sure that the baby would be born in the hospital and would be taken care of. So that resulted in the Sisters of Life. But a couple of things that it's just so interesting now. I hate to say the fact that You just don't hear the hierarchy now that's going out there and battling and saying, you know, come on, this isn't the way to do it. And it's this nonsense that's happening with them signing things that even if a baby is born, you can just let it die. It's frightening. It really is. So, you know, I miss him more now than ever because of that. And hearing him say, it's not right. This is not the way it is. In New York, they wanted him to, he always had, there were always detectives in the cathedral, always plainclothesmen guarding him because, of course, he had problems with ACT UP. ACT UP invaded the cathedral at one point, threw condoms at him, and you know, it was just a terrible scene. And what did he do? He stopped the mass. He stood right in front of the tabernacle. Never said a word, just stood in front of the tabernacle, but it gave them the idea, you don't come up here, you don't get to that tabernacle. And that was, and strangely enough, it was a day when seminarians were there, and you know, there was always a lot of other priests there. And when they saw that, at first they were startled, but it didn't take more than a couple of minutes before all of them got up, and they were right behind him. So it was quite a scene. And I laughed because in the newspaper the next day, the Post, it had him standing in front of the cathedral, opened the doors, and you know, it was like, not on my watch, you don't. So it was an interesting front page picture, you know. But he was determined, that, very determined with that. Yes, Bob?
During the Mass, it was Bernard Herring, it was Bernard Law who gave the homily, I believe, at the time of his funeral, but that aside.
Oh.
And there was a point where he mentioned the whole pro-life issue, and the Sisters of Life began the applause, and it went right through the church and our leaders in that country. It was Clintons at the time, right?
Right.
They didn't stand for this thing.
At
The
first,
rest of them
they
stood up for this thing, just like it happened when Mother Teresa did that prayer
Right.
speech too. It was a powerful moment.
Yes, it was. It really was.
He would go to hospitals and clean out, but he worked, doing.
The AIDS. Well, he was the only one.
Yeah.
He was the one that established St. Clair's Hospital. Nobody, there was no access to medical care for any AIDS patients. And he, with St. Clair Hospital in New York, he said, we're opening an AIDS unit. And at that time, all of the hospitals were under the care of the Cardinal, and he said, we're opening an AIDS unit. And he would go, he was a terrible sleeper. He didn't sleep very much. And he would go, sometimes in the middle of the night, to the hospital to visit the AIDS patients. You hear stories of him washing their hair, but he would talk to them for hours because nobody, they were just abandoned people. And some of the stories that he heard were about young people that said that, they had no idea about some of this, and they came to this country and they were perfectly normal, but they didn't have jobs, they didn't have money, and were dragged into things that occurred that caused them to get AIDS. It was very sad. It was a sad thing, but he lifted their spirits, often went with them to different, when they went to Lourdes, he would get a contingent, and the young people of Malta in particular would go. One of my girls went just about every year when they would take them, and many of them were AIDS patients that would go. And it's so sad when you see some of this. My children, it was interesting too. When my brother was in the Navy, still in the Navy, he was the first senior chaplain that was a Catholic at the Naval Academy. I'm not really sure if they've had another Catholic since, because it had always been Methodist, Episcopalian, something else, but it was never a Catholic. So, and at the time, he lived in the big house, and he was responsible then. The idea was, if you lived in one of the big houses, that you had to bring in the drags, as they called, the weekend dates for the midshipmen. Now, there were no women there when he was there. And he said, oh, I can't do that. I can't live here and bring in all these young girls. Can you imagine? And so at the time, I had one of my girls was graduating from high school. So I said to her, okay, Joanne, you come down and live with me. That way, I'm not here alone, so I can bring in these girls. Okay. It was this huge house, 3-floor house. So she did that, and Joanne was, I'd say she was one of my children who's rather lively. I said he got such a good taste of what it was like to raise teenagers that it was incomprehensible. He just was crazy. One of the prime examples of something she did, you had to go through a gate, of course, when you go into the academy. And he had a sign in the car that you could put up in the windshield if you went to visit somebody, and it said chaplain on call. So she had been out one night, probably later than she should have been, and she got home and she got to the gate and they stopped her and she took the sign and put the chaplain on call in the window. And of course then they let her through, and she put it in, good night, went through. This is the kind of thing he put up with, so I got a good taste of teenagers. But we spent a lot of time going to the academy, the whole family, so that was an interesting experience. She did go to school down there, though, so that helped. And then
Did you go to the Naval Academy?
No, there were no.
Probably went to St. Mary's High School.
No, she was out of high school. She went to Anne Arundel College down there. So no, they didn't have women then.
That's right.
Because, that's a new one. In fact, one of the Sisters of Life, I was talking to her when she was doing dishes and was cleaning up after dinner. And I usually, when I meet the new ones, I say, where did you go to college? What did you do? And she said, I went to the Naval Academy. She went to the Naval Academy, served her 5 years, and joined the Sisters of Life, and she's now professed, so she's there to stay. Then I had another one, my youngest daughter, Eileen, went to the University of Scranton, so she spent a lot of time with her uncle, and has really, this is the way it was with all of my children. So we were just very closely knit to him, and it was our horror as time went on when he died. But as a result,
The incident when Geraldine Ferraro was nominated for vice president.
oh, good grief.
How your brother reacted.
Not well. Not well. At the time, I guess Bevilacqua was a bishop, and they tried to get her to change her mind. That didn't happen, but that, O'Connor would have a few words to say about it. So he wasn't generally pleased. So, there was no question about it. If anyone knew him at all, they knew that being pro-life was the way to go. There were no two ways about it. It was never anything else. If any of you can get a hold of a book, I think this is so great because it gives you what people said about him. After he died, this young fellow, Terry Galway, went around and taped family members, people that he taught in high school, people that are, just people in New York that knew him, people that worked with him. And it's extremely interesting. One of the things that I think stands out in it, he said at one time, he couldn't think of anything else that he'd rather be than a priest. So, and it's true. I mean, this was just so ingrained in him that there was nothing that could make him change on that. He said, sure, it's nice to go home from work and have your wife and children, and maybe to be a doctor or a lawyer or something else, but he said, no, it's nothing like being a priest.
Mary, you mentioned that Cardinal started Sisters of Life in 1991, was it?
Yes.
And now they're up to over 100
Yes.
Sisters of Life.
There was so much going on. Even now, I can't imagine. I just can't imagine him being in New York with this crazy homo. I mean, this would be something else. But I think I had said before that they wanted him to wear a bulletproof vest in the cathedral all the time because there was so much of this, kind of thing, as I said, act coming in and standing up in the middle of the mass and throwing condoms and that kind of thing. And so they thought he should. And he said, oh, that's ridiculous. They'll shoot me in the head. So he never would wear a bulletproof vest. So no matter where he went, it just didn't happen. No, that's not true. When he went to Lebanon, I think they insisted on it when he was there. He traveled all over the world, even as Cardinal, traveled all over the world. But the Sisters of Life, he wrote articles, and this book is the articles he wrote in Catholic New York. And if you ever want to see how disappointed he was when I was born, it's one of the first articles in here. But this is good because this also gives the impressions of all the things that were happening. And he wrote an article one time about we are in need of a group who will dedicate themselves to pro-life. And he thought it was beyond the group of just people. And he got hundreds of letters from young women who said, we're with you. Well, he thought, well, I opened my big mouth, now I have to do something about it. So he started the Sisters of Life. And they had 5. They started out, there were maybe 8, but 3 of them, dropped out. So there were 5 that stayed. And he thought, this was interesting because, of course, he had a pension from the Navy, and it was that pension that supported the whole thing, the whole start of the Sisters of Life. The 5 And I was at the ceremony not too long ago where the 5 who stayed celebrated their 25th anniversary. Now they're in the Sisters of Life for about 6 years. They're all college graduates. Most of them had super duper jobs before they ever went in. They have lawyers, they have doctor, they have any number of vocations that you can believe. It's not outside of the realm of being a Sister of Life. But now they have over 100. And my brother said, well, I put it together. He had to support them too. There was no money came from the diocese. He supported them with his retirement fund. He had to cover their insurance. He had to keep them insured. He had to do everything. Had to house them. They had to feed them. Had to do all of this. And he said, I can start it, but it's up to the Holy Spirit. If it's going to work, it's the Holy Spirit. Well, it's worked because now they're over 100. They have 9 that are entering this time. And I am amazed because I keep thinking in this crazy world as it is now, these young women who all have these fantastic educations and jobs, they're finding something that's not in the world. They don't want to be part of it. So they're a contemplative and evangelization order. So they wear full habits. They started with one little house in New York that was their convent, and they ended up with convents in Suffern, New York. In the city of New York, there's 1 or 2 convents. They have one in Denver. They have one in Stamford, Connecticut, where you can go for a retreat. They even have a workman's retreat once a year. They have them there's one in Philadelphia now. It just keeps going. You know, and absolutely it's the Holy Spirit. You can start something, but you can't keep it going without some outside help. So it's just amazing. It's things that, as I said, I can tell you 100 stories about him. I traveled with him any number of times. I was extremely fortunate because in Rome I saw things that without the Cardinal I wouldn't have seen. It was interesting being up on the very top you've seen pictures of St. Peter's, and when you're up at the top where they have all the saint statues, and I've been up there looking down at the crowd, which is interesting. Been in the Vatican Gardens. You can go to Rome 500 times. You never see everything at all. But I've been in Rome with him. I've been in Spain with him. But it was nice to travel with him, I'll say that. But some of the funny things about him, when he got to New York, our family would vacation in the Poconos. I don't know if you're familiar with the Pocono Mountains in Pennsylvania. And once in a while he would come up and stay with us for a few days. We were up there one time, and he decided he was going to play tennis, but he was totally unprepared as far as wardrobe was concerned. So he had a pair of shorts and a shirt, but no sneakers or nothing like that. So he went down and he's playing tennis with my children, and he had on his black shoes and his socks, playing tennis. and a couple of young fellows came by, and they were watching this going on, and finally said to one of my girls, "Is that the Cardinal of New York?" She said, "Yes." You know, she was ashamed to say yes because of the outfit he was wearing. So at Christmas, of course, he got many, many outfits. You know. Everybody decided to buy him tennis clothes. I don't think he ever played tennis after that.
What were some of the other sports you liked besides tennis?
He was an excellent sportsman. In the seminary, he was also excellent in sports. In fact, would break things every once in a while from doing things. But that's why I said he taught me different things about, you know, as a horseback riding. Whenever he came home, we'd go ice skating. We'd do any number of things. But he was good at baseball, things that they could do in the seminary. The seminary was very tight. St. Charles Seminary is a much different seminary than the one that he went to, because we had Cardinal Doherty at the time, who was very old school. Of course, we were old school too, so it didn't seem strange to us. But when you entered, there were very few times that you got out, and you went for 10 years. They didn't care how much education you had before you went in. You went for 10 years. He went a little less than that because during the war, they kept them, they wouldn't let them go home for the summer because some of the seminarians had been jumped and called draft dodgers. So the Pope was, or the Cardinal didn't want to.
I worked in New York while your brother was Cardinal, and I remember certain things. Now, did your brother ever say anything to you about two New Yorkers? Did he ever say anything to you about Malachi Martin? And also, Donald Trump mentions having a dinner with your brother in the Art of the Deal. Did he ever say anything about Donald Trump and that particular dinner? Or?
Not that I can recall. I think that I understand if you personally meet Donald Trump, is extremely nice and very generous, and I think that I think it was interesting because the one thing I remember is Donald Trump saying that my brother was a good businessman.
Yeah, I believe
That he had a good head for business, and he had an amazing amount of knowledge. He just no matter what the situation was, he always seemed to have a handle on it. And of course, he was the one. Father Pavone went to him and asked to be. He said that he wanted to be the pro-life priest, and he's the one that appointed him to that role. And that was, he felt
He started Priest for Life.
yes, one of the best things he could have possibly done. He picked the right one. As many times as they tried to get, the others tried to get him out of there, never happened. You know, I mean, Father, when Egan came in, yeah.
That was arranged.
Mary, you mentioned tithing, that you gave talks on tithing. Could you elaborate on that, please?
Oh, I did it for so many years. Tithing is, the McKenna Tithing Group is a group dedicated to just trying to go into parishes and reminding people that they have to contribute to the church because that's the only way we exist. Strangely enough, one of the things was we never actually told people to give money. We never actually brought money up at all. What we did is try to point out in a talk that you're given 100%, you give 10% of your income. And everyone had the same question. Before taxes? Yes. 5% to the church and 5% for your other charitable endeavors. So the big thing, it's really, it sounds difficult, but you never have to, you have to tell people, you know, God has given you this. You have this money coming in, you've got your jobs, you've got this, but it's not a lot when you're asking 5% to your church and you keep the other 90%. But it's very difficult in these days. Not only, of course, you have the attendance at churches that falls off so much, and the people don't want to part with your money. I know because I count. I'm one of the counters at church, so I know that they aren't big on that. But it's we traveled all over. It was not just our diocese. I've been Florida. Was in Decatur, Georgia. I was in, which was funny. I met a woman in Decatur, Georgia, who patted me on the arm when she went out and said, "I know all about tithing. I used to be a Baptist." We had once a year we would have a luncheon and usually have a priest speaker who would tell us how well it worked at his parish. And then, you know, sometimes it helps, you know, to stir the people up that were doing it, try to reinforce it for them. And it's hard. But Frank and I both did it. My second husband and I, we did it I met for 20 years. And then I think the last time finally, I finally said uncle and had to stop because it was really, the two of us were older, and you go for a weekend and speak at every mass. So it's a lot of work, and you go to various places. I think the last one that we did was in Virginia Beach. So you're traveling all the time on a weekend. So
tell us about when you were going to West Catholic High School for girls, how you had lost your father. Apparently he might have died from lead poisoning.
Eventually he did die from that, but he was...
and how you went to work at age 14 at Strawbridge and Clothier.
I went to West Catholic. I loved the fact that my brother, who went to West Catholic for such a short time, is one of the people that they say graduated in 1937. In 1937, he was already in the seminary, so it was kind of a trick to have graduated then. But at least West Catholic boys, now the boys and girls are combined in the girls' school. But they dedicated a room to him. I forget what it is now, which room now. I think, I don't know. But when I went to West Catholic, since I was the last of the O'Connors, my father had become ill, had been ill for many years for me. It was almost as though my brother and I were raised with a different father, but my father had become ill. And I went to work when I was 14. I was I think just a freshman. I was young when I was in high school. For some reason, I don't know. I think I skipped a half grade or something somewhere along the line, so it put me on the younger edge for the grade. And because my father was ill, and my brother, my older brother and my sister were both married, and because my brother was a priest by that time, I went to work when I was 14 after school. And Jack had asked me about that, and I said, yeah, well, I get finished school, and I'd go get on the L and go into Philadelphia and worked in Strawbridge's in the stock department. and lied about my age until I finally got to be 16 and could get my, you had to get papers to work because you had to be 16 to work. And I kept saying, oh, yeah, I'm going to get those next week, And of course, the next week was a couple years later. but anyway, that was that. But what do you want to hear about the Cardinal? I was going to say that traveling with him for me was amazing because, believe me, he walked into an airport, everybody knew him. And of course, you got to go into the little room to wait for the plane, in one of these very fancy places where they wanted to give you all kinds of things. And then you'd start out with a regular ticket, but you always ended up in first class. So it was just an amazing thing to travel with him. And when he was made the Cardinal of New York, we had to go to Rome, of course, for him to, because there were, I think at the time, there were 26 cardinals that were, at that time, that were made at the one time. And we went on Pan Am, and we had a very good friend that worked for Pan Am. She was a stewardess for Pan Am. And she managed to get the airplane saying, Cardinal O'Connor, on the front of it. And our whole family sat in first class. We all went first class. Now, my sister, my older sister at the time, had never been in an airplane. Now, she was 12 years older than I, so she was not a youngster at the time. They gave her some kind of mild thing, and she just was out the whole trip. She didn't know what was happening. But it was fun to travel with him. And as I said, I traveled with him quite a bit. Even though, in and out of, I fortunately had a very good, kind Catholic boss who was also now back on, both he and I were on the board of the Mother's Home in Darby, Pennsylvania. And he's on that board now. And one of the Lawyers for Life, which you don't hear much about anymore, but we had a big group of Lawyers for Life. And many nights he would be at the courthouse overnight, because people would be picked up, they'd be jailed for their pro-life demonstration, and he would be there getting them out, because then they wouldn't give their names, and so he'd spend the whole night as they processed people to get them out, get them home. So I was very lucky, and in fact, even when my brother was made a cardinal, he and his wife came with us to New York, or to Rome. So I got to go off more than I probably would have if I worked in some other place. But we just...
Are there any efforts that you know about, Mary, to promote the canonization for sainthood?
I hear about it, but I don't pay much attention to it. I think the sisters would like that. But I think eventually it'll happen. It won't be in my lifetime, I'm sure. I hope that it will be in the lifetime of some of the others, of some of the children. But I never ask.
Does anybody else have any comments or questions for me?
Yes.
And that goes, yes.
I just wanted to say I've always admired your brother, the Cardinal, and particularly his connection with the pro-life. And when they had his funeral, I taped it. I had a VCR tape at that time, and I have it at home. It's like funeral ceremony.
I have it at home and nothing I can play it on anymore.
No, I have to have mine transferred to the, have it transferred one day to see,
I think, yeah.
And my brother, I have a brother named Jack too.
Oh,
And his
really?
name is John.
Yeah.
He's
no.
7 years older than me too.
Just an anecdote that I remember when, I thought he graduated with a master's or something from Villanova as well.
Yes, he does have a master's from
He
Villanova.
was there in the Villanova's for life, and I spoke that night, but sat at the table with him, and one of the things he wanted to know was your background, the people that he was going to meet.
Oh, yes.
He would ask that ahead of time, a couple of days, and then you'd write that. But his opening remarks were contrary to what we were saying a little bit about knowing him everywhere. He said, well, you know, I says, I'm not known by everybody. A lot of people think that. He says, there was an elderly couple that was down the street. He says, they saw me and he said, who is this? I said, what's this? That? Is he Cook or is he O'Connor? And the lady, and the guy says, he says, I don't know. He's the one that's living. So that remark after he says, I hope I'm the one that's living.
Oh, yeah.
How many children in addition on that?
There were 5, one died at birth, so there were 4 of us lived.
Brother was number 1,
No, he was number 3.
and you
Uh,
last.
And I was the baby. I'm a 92-year-old baby. So it's interesting. I brought this book because it has a couple of pictures in it. One when he was in Tilden High School. That was actually the middle school, because after that was John Bartram High School, if you were from Philadelphia. And the one where he was, when he was ordained. So, very young, 25 when he was ordained.
Can you pull that up so we don't, oh, wow.
Yeah.
God bless.
And
Was he ordained at St. Peter's and Paul in Philadelphia?
yes. And there's a picture in here. This is when he was in Ethiopia. And I have a picture at home where he's holding a child, and he's holding a child here. But the funny thing is that one of the priests that was with him and the photographer, Chris Sheridan at the time, he was there, was the photographer, traveled with him all the time and took pictures. He said when they got to Ethiopia, of course, such a poor country, that they opened the door to the airplane, and everybody, the odor was overwhelming. Now these people were starving, so they had no facilities at all, except for the Cardinal. And he got right off the plane, went right into the middle of all the people, and never changed his expression. It was just smiled and went right in, picked up children, and practically cried at some of the children who they were so emaciated, and it was sad, you know. And I have one at home where he's holding a child that God knows what age they are, but they're just bones, you know. It's terrible. I don't know if anything has improved there or not. And there's a picture here of him saying Mass on the Jeep. Or no, this was on the Canberra. It was a ship that he was on, and they pulled in at Norfolk. And when they did that, when he pulled in at Norfolk, of course, my dear husband said, okay, we have to go visit him. Now, my children were like this at that stage. And we got in the car, and we went down and visited him in Norfolk. So, well, I mean, that was such an unusual relationship, because my brother would call and say to my husband, I'm confirming children, you know, when he was in the service. And when he was in Vietnam, he would out of the Navy and in the Marines, because of course they have that they can do that. And we'd go down, go to the confirmation, have dinner with them, and go back home. I mean, it was, my husband would have, as I said, he would have driven to the moon if my brother asked him to. So, and I think Frank would have done the same, but he never got to meet him. So, but he just was, he drew people in. It didn't matter if you were a scullery maid or the Queen of England. You were somebody, you know, to him, you were a person. You were one of God's children. He had that, and he never felt anything different about it. Although I laugh because he was, you know, even in New York, he had the tiniest little bedroom, which he chose. But it was on the 3rd floor. This place was 4 floors. He had a little tiny kitchen, would often just go in, make his own breakfast, and go down. He would meet with all the priests when he went down. Many of them lived in the residence, the vicar and the different bishops, and they lived there. It was certainly a huge place. But he would go down and sit with them and maybe have a cup of coffee, and then they discuss the things of the day. But he would, you know, there was nothing that, like, demanding any kind of service. He was not interested in that at all. And his housekeeper's name was Maura Kelly, who went to that residence when she was 17 years old and started, I think, with Spellman. She was there for Cardinal Cook. She was there. But of course, as she went up, and by the time my brother arrived, she was, at that point, was the housekeeper. And she ran the show, pretty much. And she ran the priest pretty much, too. And I remember her remarking to me one time, but she laughed, because one of them wanted something, you know, and sometimes they would be grumpy about something. So whenever they wanted it now, you know, kind of thing. We all get into that kind of mood sometimes. And she looked at me and she said, when they die and go to heaven, they'll never know the difference. I just laughed because she figured they got such good treatment as it was. But it's hard. I think that...
Do we have 1 or 2 closing comments or questions? Or
Yes.
Yes.
Was your brother big on Eucharistic adoration, and if so, how often did he do it? You know, what period of time, like an hour a day, half hour a day, or?
For what?
Eucharistic adoration.
Oh, good grief. That for him in the morning anyway at the residence when I stayed there. I spent a lot of time there when he was sick. They would gather in the chapel there and do the office, but he was, as I said, he didn't sleep much. And he would often go over to the cathedral in the middle of the night just to walk around, say the stations, say the rosary, that kind of thing. Of course, one night it was kind of dark and he clunked into something when he was over at the cathedral. He was as accident prone as I am, so he was always getting into a problem, and that's, he had a crash in a helicopter. He was in a helicopter and they were running out of gas, and he said, well, when he was in the Navy, and he said he prayed that if he get there safely, I'll stop smoking. At that time, he had stopped cigarettes years before, but he was smoking cigars. He stopped smoking cigars.
That's it. One more question or comment. Mary, I think you should be promoted for sainthood too.
Oh, sure.
As long as we were your brother. This has been delightful.
Well, it's just not enough time to tell you everything.
Yeah, I think there's many books waiting.